Look at this soldier's face. His eyes are empty. His hands won't stop shaking. He's 22 years old, and he'll never be the same again. This photograph was taken in 1916 and immediately locked away by the British government. Not because it showed death, but because it showed something far more dangerous. A man completely broken by war, still breathing. Today, we're finally uncovering what they tried to bury. The reality of trench warfare. World War I didn't just take lives. It shattered minds in ways no previous conflict had. And military leadership knew it was happening, they simply refused to acknowledge it publicly. Picture this reality. You're 19 years old, standing in a trench carved into French soil. The walls are barely wide enough to stretch your arms. Cold water rises to your knees. Rats, some as large as house cats, crawl over sleeping soldiers, gnawing on boots, sometimes feeding on the deceased. The smell is overwhelming, a mixture of damp earth, human waste, and decay. You haven't truly slept in days. Every time you close your eyes, the ground trembles. Above you, artillery shells scream through the air. Each explosion hits approximately 140 decibels, loud enough to cause permanent hearing damage, making your entire body vibrate from the shockwave. One blast, then another, thousands of them, continuing day after day, week after week, month after month. Your brain stops processing them as individual events. They merge into one endless roar that follows you even in silence. Modern neuroscience has proven that prolonged exposure to blast waves physically alters brain tissue, particularly in regions controlling memory, emotion, and fear response. But in 1916, if you collapsed from psychological exhaustion, military leadership labeled you a coward. The photographs that were hidden. One photograph from the Battle of the Somme captures a soldier mid-combat, completely frozen. His rifle hangs loosely in his grip. His mouth is open, but he's not making a sound. His consciousness has retreated somewhere his body cannot follow. Medical historians now call this the 1,000-yard stare. His fellow soldiers had to physically carry him back to the trench. According to military records, he never spoke another word. Another image shows a young man barely 20 years old sitting upright in a military hospital bed, both hands trembling so severely he cannot hold a drinking cup. His body survived the battlefield. His nervous system did not. The British Army had no framework for understanding these men. Initially, commanding officers assumed they were faking their symptoms. They called it malingering. If you refused to return to combat, you faced military trial. If found guilty, the penalty could be execution. Between 1914 and 1918, 306 British soldiers were executed by firing squad, not for desertion in the face of the enemy, but for breaking under psychological pressure their commanders refused to recognize as legitimate medical conditions. If this investigation is resonating with you, consider subscribing, because what comes next reveals the experimental treatments doctors used on these men and why these photographs remained classified for nearly a century. The story of Private Harry Farr. Private Harry Farr was 25 years old, a shoemaker from London. He had survived months of continuous bombardment at the Somme. When his unit received orders to return to the front lines, Farr collapsed, shaking uncontrollably, physically unable to hold his weapon. Medical officers examined him and declared him fit for duty. When he refused to return, not out of cowardice, but because his body would not respond to his commands, he was convicted and executed by firing squad in October 1916. His wife received no military pension. The army officially listed him as having died in disgrace. It took 90 years until 2006 for the British government to grant him a posthumous pardon. By then, the gesture meant nothing to those who had suffered. Experimental treatments. The men who weren't executed were sent to military medical facilities. But these weren't healing centers in any modern sense. They became testing grounds for desperate, often harmful experimental procedures. Doctors had no established framework for understanding psychological trauma, so they experimented with various methods. One widely used approach: electroconvulsive therapy without anesthesia. Soldiers were restrained to metal beds, electrodes pressed against their temples, and high-voltage electrical currents sent through their brains until their bodies convulsed violently. The theory? That physical shock could somehow reset damaged neural pathways. In practice, it simply layered additional trauma onto already devastated minds. A photograph from one facility shows a physician gripping a soldier's wrist as his arm shakes violently. The doctor's expression is clinical, detached. The soldier's face shows pure terror. Another image captures a ward filled with men sitting motionless in rows, staring straight ahead. They appear almost statue-like. But these are living human beings, their minds shut down by horrors they couldn't process. Some were placed in isolation rooms for extended periods, left alone with the mental echoes of artillery fire still replaying in their consciousness. The goal wasn't healing. The goal was making them compliant enough to return to combat. Dr. W.H.R. Rivers, a different approach. But not every physician believed in harsh methods. In Edinburgh, at Craiglockhart War Hospital, one man chose a revolutionary different path. Dr. W.H.R. Rivers, a neurologist and anthropologist, refused to treat his patients like broken equipment. He talked to them. He listened. He believed that if soldiers could verbalize their trauma, the internal pressure might begin to ease. This was genuinely revolutionary in 1917. The concept of empathy as medicine. One of his patients was the poet Siegfried Sassoon, who would later create some of the most powerful anti-war poetry in literary history. In his work, Rivers appears as the one authority figure who didn't demand obedience, only honesty. Photographs from Craiglockhart show something the other facilities don't: natural light streaming through windows, men sitting together in conversation, no restraints, no electrodes, just human connection. It was evidence that understanding could accomplish what punishment never could. However, military leadership resisted Rivers' methods. His approach didn't return men to combat quickly enough. They recovered too slowly, or sometimes not at all. So, the army continued favoring harsher treatments, the ones that appeared efficient in reports, even if they destroyed what remained of a soldier's psychological well-being. Naming the condition. The first physician to officially name this condition was Dr. Charles Myers, a Cambridge psychologist. In February 1915, he published a paper in the Lancet Medical Journal introducing the term shell shock. He argued that constant blast wave exposure and emotional overload caused measurable neurological injury. It wasn't weakness, it wasn't moral failing, it was trauma. The military's response? They classified his research findings as dangerous to military morale. His photographs and clinical notes were locked in classified archives. For the remainder of the war, the term shell shock was prohibited from official medical documentation. But reality couldn't be suppressed. Field medical officers kept observing identical symptoms: trembling, paralysis, loss of speech, sudden blindness without physical cause. According to British War Office archives, more than 80,000 cases were officially documented. Modern historical research estimates the actual number exceeded 250,000, nearly 1 in every 10 soldiers who served. Some of the most disturbing images show young men whose hair turned completely white within days, a documented physiological reaction to extreme stress. Others show soldiers in rehabilitation facilities, mouths moving, attempting to speak after months of silence. No sound emerges. The words remain trapped inside. These photographs were suppressed for decades. The reason? Because they shattered the propaganda narrative. They proved that military glory carried a price too devastating to celebrate in public. They proved that victory didn't erase suffering, it only concealed it behind closed doors. And governments worldwide couldn't afford that truth to become widespread knowledge. The aftermath. After the armistice, hundreds of thousands of veterans returned home unable to work, maintain sleep patterns, or function in daily life. There was no vocabulary for their experience. Many were institutionalized in psychiatric facilities. Others lived homeless, haunted by memories they couldn't articulate. Families struggled to recognize the men who returned wearing their loved ones' faces but carrying strangers' eyes. Society collectively looked away. Shell shock faded from public conversation, replaced by uncomfortable silence. The pattern repeats. The next generation went to war believing the same false narrative that mental fortitude alone could protect the mind from trauma. World War II called it combat fatigue. Korea called it battle neurosis or operational exhaustion. Vietnam called it post-Vietnam syndrome. Different conflicts, same fundamental wound, same institutional denial. It wasn't until 1980 that the American Psychiatric Association officially recognized post-traumatic stress disorder as a legitimate medical diagnosis in the DSM-3 diagnostic manual. Modern understanding. Contemporary neuroscience has confirmed what Myers and Rivers suspected a century ago. Trauma physically restructures the brain. MRI and fMRI scans demonstrate that regions controlling fear response, memory consolidation, and emotional regulation undergo structural changes after repeated traumatic exposure. The trembling soldiers of 1916 and the veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan share the same invisible neurological injuries. That connection gives profound new significance to those old photographs. They're no longer merely historical artifacts, they're medical evidence spanning across time. The legacy. Today, historians and medical professionals view those suppressed photographs as crucial turning points in medical history. They forced society to confront psychological injury with the same seriousness as visible physical wounds. They proved that a soldier could be fundamentally broken without any external signs of damage. But they also carry another crucial message: institutional accountability. For every image of a man trembling in a hospital bed, there's an invisible system that condemned him. Commanders who refused to recognize trauma as real, governments that denied compensation and support, societies that mistook suffering for shame. Over 100 years later, those images finally speak to new audiences. They remind us that progress in understanding mental health was paid for in silence, in stigma, in the destroyed lives of men punished simply for being human. When we examine them now, we don't see weakness. We see endurance, the cost of witnessing horrors that language cannot adequately describe. We see the origin point of every modern therapy session, every PTSD diagnosis, every conversation about mental health that attempts to transform pain into healing. The story of shell shock isn't merely military history. It's the story of how humanity learned to recognize the mind as inseparable from the body. How we learned that bravery and vulnerability can coexist in the same moment. A century ago, these truths were hidden because they threatened established power structures. Today, they're revealed because they protect people. If uncovering these buried historical realities matters to you, subscribe and share this investigation. Let others discover what institutions tried to erase, that the true cost of conflict isn't measured only in casualties, but in the quiet internal battles that never truly end. Drop a comment telling me which photograph haunted you most. These men deserve to be remembered not as failures, but as casualties of a conflict that broke them in ways no one was prepared to understand. History can be rewritten, files can be destroyed, but photographs never lie. They wait patiently until someone is brave enough to truly look.